When Bill and I talked, and we talked about the presentation, the initial thought was how World War II created modern Norway. I had to amend the title a little bit because modern Norway, of course, wasn't created right away. You can go back as far as you want, but I decided I had to start with something, and I actually found out the Great Nordic War was a good starting point. And we can take the next slide. Now, so what is modern Norway? Now, there really, when you think about it, there's maybe four issues that are, or four items that make up a modern nation, or compared to what we had a few hundred years ago. One is geography, and I'll take that first because it's the easiest. And there's been very little change in Norway and Scandinavia. And Norway and Scandinavia is almost, you can't talk about Norwegian history without touching on Scandinavian history. And this is really sort of a short version of how Norway and the other nations have changed. And there hasn't been that much. The biggest change in Norway was in 1645 when Jämtland and Härjedalen, which you see sort of halfway through Sweden, that area was lost. The other areas that were lost were some smaller areas down in the south, which at the time Norway stretched almost to Gothenburg. But in big scheme of things, it wasn't that big. And the same goes for Sweden and Finland and Denmark. Skåne was Danish 300-400 years ago, but again, the geographical part of Scandinavia has stayed very much unchanged through the centuries. The next is population, and again, there hasn't been that much change. Now, the change that has come, apart from a steadily growing population, is really that over the last, since Second World War, there's been a lot of immigration. And today, fun enough, Norway has more foreign-born citizens than the United States as a percentage of the population. So the population in previous centuries tended to, of course, be from the other Scandinavian countries. There were some Germans, some Brits, etc., of course, some Dutch. But by and large, they were into Scandinavian movements and could have to do with economic fortunes, etc. That has changed. And today, of course, the Pakistanis, which is a pretty big group, that was the first group I can remember growing up in Norway, where you started seeing a lot of people that were obviously from a different country. Since then, there's been from many parts of the world. And when you go to Oslo today, it's quite diverse, quite a diverse city. And compared to when I grew up, extremely diverse. So the next thing is politics. And that there, of course, has been big, big changes over the centuries. And the same with the economy. And that's why I felt I had to go back to at least the Great Nordic War. So if we go to the next slide. Now, the Great Nordic War, why start there? Well, it was really the last time the Scandinavian countries waged war against each other. Now, we have been at war since then. Napoleonic War, of course, is the big example. But the two following wars, the Lingonberry War, which was a sort of a strange little episode, which cost the Norwegian army 3,000-4,000 men. We don't know exactly how many, but 8 of them died in fighting. The rest died from starvation and hunger when they were trying to take part of Sweden. But there was no interest on the soldiers. The Great Nordic War had impoverished the Scandinavian kingdoms, and to such an extent that I think the whole attitude towards kings and so on changed. And it was really the change from a very static society with a king who was, there was God, and the king was sort of like wedged himself between God and the rest of us, and that disappeared over the following centuries. And that started really with the Great Nordic War. Norway's losses in the Great Nordic War were quite enormous. As a percentage, again, of the population, if World War II, which costed about 10,000 Norwegians their lives, if the loss rate had been equal to the Great Nordic War, Norway would have lost over 200,000 people. So, which is enormous. I mean, Norway and the US actually had about the same percentage loss of people during World War II. The US population about 50 times the size. So instead of 10,000, it was 500,000. But so the Great Nordic War was a watershed, and it was also realization, I think, in the government, and by that at that time that was really the king, his ministers, and the rich and the wealthy, the noblemen, the aristocracy, big landowners, that we being the Scandinavian countries were small countries. We couldn't really wage war on a continental scale. France, Germany, Russia, not least, could take big losses that the Scandinavian countries could not do that. During the Great Nordic War, Sweden won some spectacular victories, but when it turned, they really lost only one big war or one big battle. But of course, they couldn't replace the soldiers the way the other countries could. So none of the Scandinavian countries became democracies right after the Great Nordic War. That took time, but it started to change. And it also was the first time in history we can really see a Norwegian identity. There was during and after, there was a realization in Norway that we were Norwegians. We were separate from Denmark. And that was because Denmark had made some disposition, some choices that were good for Denmark, but not for Norway. And it showed that our interests were not always aligned. And I think people started realizing that. So that was when Norway, and the rest of Scandinavia had changed in the sense that Sweden lost the Baltics, which was too bad for the Baltics when we know how prosperous and wealthy Sweden became, and Russia was anything but.